Star Trek, Starfleet Academy, Crisis on Vulcan, Chapter 5. Spock stood in the arched doorway, watching his father. The two of them were back on Vulcan, in the family home. More than 2 weeks had passed since their escape from the Marathon fighters. In that time, the Federation had come close to sending armed ships against the rebel faction. Only Sarek's considerable powers of persuasion had averted a military reaction. Now, on his first full day home, Sarek was conferring with the various Marathon parties by subspace communication, one at a time, with infinite patience. Spock watched him silently, realizing how hard Sarek's task was. Beyond his father, through one of the many windows, Spock could see the arid, strangely compelling landscape of foothills and rolling plains, with an orange sky overhead. The hot, thin air was a relief after weeks of breathing alien atmosphere. And all in all, being home should have been a welcome experience, and yet... Sarek sat before a subspace view screen that filled most of one wall. "I repeat," Spock's father was saying in his soft, even voice, "I cannot understand your people's actions. Starfleet Command is most displeased at Minnick's attempt on the Enterprise. Only the grave importance of Marath as a strategic outpost has prevented the Federation from canceling all exchanges with your people. It required a good deal of insistence on my part to prevent armed retaliation against the rebel fighter fleet." "I am sorry," said one of the several Marathons on screen. The group of them huddled close together, with one or the other occasionally whispering in the spokesman's ear. All strove to keep their faces blank, betraying no thought, no emotion. A useless endeavor when facing a Vulcan. Far away as he was, Spock recognized signs of tension, repressed anger, deep dissatisfaction. "We of Marath have no control over rebel forces. Surely you understand that." "I do," Sarek acknowledged. "But, Mr. Ambassador, surely you understand that without the cooperation of the Marathons on the planet Shakir, we cannot possibly add the final codicils to the treaty." "Perhaps you should return," the Marathon suggested. "No," Sarek said. "An accord imposed from without is no accord at all. It is vital to your people, to your entire star system, to reach agreement. The Shakir delegates have given me no explanation. Ambassador Marr is nowhere to be found, and the others are at odds. They cannot even agree on how to proceed with the treaty." Sarek leaned closer, tenting his fingers. "Sir, I sense some flaw in the treaty, at least from the point of view of the Shakir delegation. What is the significance of Amendment 111? "No significance that we need discuss," the ambassador returned quickly. "It merely has to do with certain areas of Marath that the exiles consider an ancient homeland. Of course, our own people live there now. To evict them is impossible. Even if we did so, few of the Shakir colonists would return." "If we might reconsider the amendment." "Even Minnick agreed to drop the amendment from consideration," snapped the ambassador. "That should be enough for you." After a moment of silence, Sarek said, "Let us agree to convene by subspace conference link in 3 standard days. Perhaps with all parties participating, we may be able to resolve this deadlock." The screen went blank. Sarek leaned back in his chair, and Spock saw how drawn and weary his face looked. Quietly, without speaking to his father, the young Vulcan slipped away. The day was a fine one, with a warm breeze from the south and the promise of dew later in the evening. Spock found his mother outside, carefully tending her garden. The green expanse was an oasis in the rocky foothills, an exotic one. Amanda Grayson had been a teacher, but she could well have been a botanist. She had a fine sense of what plants would grow or would not, of how to encourage a vine here to root an alien shrub there. Her garden represented Vulcan, but more than that, she had planted all sorts of off-world flora. Crimson stalks of Atlantean fire rod waved in the breeze, close to the intricate blue network of Andorian puzzle leaf. Pillow-shaped beds of the low-growing Drabidium fructus nestled against the crystalline stems of Rigelian lens trees, squat, gnarled miniature trees with crystalline lenses studding their bark. The lenses concentrated sunlight, vastly speeding the trees' photosynthesis and allowing them to spread rapidly, except that Amanda was trimming them back as Spock watched. "Hello, Spock," she said without looking up. "Hello, Mother," Spock returned. "How did you know I was watching you?" "I've known your step for something like 17 years, Amanda returned, smiling at him. "It would be strange if I didn't recognize it by now." She finished clipping the lens trees and dropped her shears into a basket. "What do you think?" Spock said gravely, "The plants appear to respond well to your nurturing. They are healthy and free of parasites." Amanda laughed. She had tied a scarf around her short hair, and now she unbound it. Spock noted that she was just beginning to show traces of gray. "Mother," he said, "why did you laugh at me?" She looked at him with affection. "Oh, Spock, I wasn't laughing at you. It's just that you can be so very Vulcan at times." "But I am Vulcan." "Only partly," she reminded him. "Let's sit in the shade and enjoy the garden." A sheltered bench, its roof overgrown with luxuriant golden web vines, gave them a cool place to sit. "I want to talk to you," Spock said slowly, "about something that happened on the way home from the Marathon system." "What you did aboard the Enterprise was reported here before you arrived," Amanda told him. "I was in town the day after it happened, and every human I ran into was buzzing with the news that you had saved a Federation ship. They think of you as a hero." "That is the trouble." Amanda waited. When Spock did not continue, she said, "Spock, you did a good thing. You used your knowledge to prevent violence. There's nothing wrong with that." "Perhaps not in itself." Spock took a deep breath. The air in the garden was pleasant, sweet with the flowers that bobbed in the breeze, pungently spicy from some of the alien pollens, an odor like cloves, cinnamon, ginger, and yet unlike them all. "Mother, when the crew thanked me for what I had done, I felt gratification." "Why shouldn't you?" Spock looked away. Beneath the orange-tinted sky, the hills of Vulcan rolled onto the horizon. "I am a Vulcan," he said simply. "Father has taught me that I must control all emotions rigidly. But of them all, I find the emotions of happiness and pleasure the hardest." "Because they feel good," Amanda said. Spock glanced at her face. She had an understanding, kind expression. "Yes," he said simply. "Mother, how does a human cope with such feelings?" "We give in to them at times," Amanda said. "Spock, do you believe that Vulcans feel no emotions at all?" Spock considered. "I know that to harbor emotions is destructive to the logical facilities. Therefore, Vulcans have eliminated emotions from their psychology." "No," Amanda said. "You're wrong." Surprised, Spock stared at her. "But Vulcans don't feel." "Oh, yes, they do," Amanda said. "Spock, you must realize that your father has been very strict with you because you are half human. That is why he has been so insistent that you learn to control your emotions. Did you think you were the only Vulcan who experienced them? You weren't. Don't you remember when you were a child? Some of the other children occasionally mocked you, didn't they?" "Yes, because I was different." "But don't you see? They were giving in to their emotions by doing so. It's just that most Vulcan parents are a little indulgent when their children are very young. They don't begin to teach them the ways of controlling emotion until they're a little older. But Sarek began your training as soon as you could speak and understand. Do you remember falling when you were 4 years old? We were in the Tascan Mountains, and you slipped down a steep hillside." Spock shook his head. "I cannot remember." "You were bruised and scratched when I got to you, but you didn't cry. I asked if you were hurt." Amanda laughed softly. "You replied by giving me a short lecture on the physiological benefits of pain, how it helps an organism to survive by identifying potential threats." "I still do not remember." Amanda touched his cheek. "That's all right. The point is that any normal Vulcan child would have cried from pain and fright. At 4, you were already too disciplined for that. Spock, have you ever read of the Stoics?" "A philosophical discipline of ancient Earth?" "That's Stoicism," corrected Amanda. "The Stoics were the ones who practiced the discipline. They believed that all excessive emotions were bad. Too much sorrow, too much joy. They too believed in controlling the emotions. But their key was control. They could no more eliminate emotion than you can, or than your father can." Spock sighed. "Still, it is disturbing that I felt such sensations when the Enterprise crew spoke well of me. They are very different from each other, not like us." "I mean," Spock groped for words, uncharacteristically at a loss. "I mean, all adult Vulcans are alike, serene, humorless, in fundamental agreement. The humans on the Enterprise had different backgrounds, different beliefs, different attitudes. They were even competitive, yet they worked so well together and each accepted the other." "Like the Idic," suggested Amanda gently. "Infinite diversity and infinite combination." "That applies to the harmony of the universe," Spock said of the Vulcan philosophical principle. "It can apply to people, too." Amanda rose. "I'm going inside. Think about what we have said, Spock. Talk to me any time about it." She left him under the shade of the golden web. He sat there until the afternoon shadows were long and sharp, before finally his mind, still unclear on certain points, he went inside. The next morning, Sarek dropped a bombshell on him. Sarek asked Spock to come into his office after breakfast. Sovic, Sarek's assistant and cousin, tactfully left father and son alone. "Well, Spock," Sarek said, "so you were the center of attention on the Enterprise. I can understand how difficult that must have been for you." "Captain April thought the rebels might actually try to kidnap you, father," Spock said. "I thought there was some urgency in assisting the crew." "I see." Sarek settled into his chair. "My son, I realize what a strain that must have been, and I could tell that, despite all of your years of discipline, you experienced emotions of pleasure at the crew's reaction to your accomplishment. That was unfortunate." Spock lowered his gaze. "I did try to control it, father." "Of course you did." "Well, you are half human, after all. A slip like that is not of the gravest importance, although it is regrettable. Still, you must realize that the Enterprise, with its undisciplined human crew, is one thing. The Vulcan Science Academy is another." "I understand." "Do you? Spock, you must be on your guard at all times. A display of emotion at the Vulcan Science Academy would ruin your chances. It would not be tolerated." Sarek picked up a printed certificate from his desk and looked at it. "That is why I have arranged for you to become a temporary student at the Academy for the next 4 weeks. Spock tilted his head. "But the next term does not begin until high summer, more than 14 weeks from now." "Precisely. I thought that this experience at the Academy, before the regular term begins, will allow you to acclimate yourself, to judge how seriously you must take your studies." Sarek passed the certificate to his son. "As you see, the occasion is an intensive 4-week seminar on artificial intelligence systems. You will have kinsmen there, and you will meet other Vulcans of your own age. I want you to devote yourself to study, but also pay attention to how other Vulcans behave." Spock read the certificate. Sarek had certainly worked hard to persuade the administration of the Vulcan Science Academy to admit him. The seminar was for second-year students. "Thank you, father," he said. Sarek nodded. You're welcome, Spock. Remember that in our language the words science and philosophy spring from the same root. Both disciplines must be pure, logical, and free of emotions. This is your chance to make up for your one slip. Make the best of it. I will, Father, Spock said, hoping that Sarek could not detect the doubt that had begun to grow in him like one of Amanda's plants. It might have started as a tiny seed, but the vine had grown strong. Spock felt it inside like a pressure on his heart, like a pain that warned him of trouble ahead. Chapter 6. The Vulcan Science Academy, Spock thought, was probably the most rationally designed institution on the entire planet. An intricate complex of gleaming silver and white domes and spires, it had the same logical elegance of a sophisticated exercise in three-dimensional geometry. Symmetry and function, mathematical exactness, and strict logic dictated the curves and sweep of its buildings. Interior rooms all received natural light that saved energy and provided plenty of illumination for their severe, simple functions. Logic dictated the relationship of room to room, building to building. On the outside, walkways and passages never followed twisting, baffling, accidental courses, but led naturally, logically, from one place to the next. At the Academy, a Vulcan always knew exactly where he stood. Then, too, the Academy blended easily and harmoniously with the tame parkland around it. The carpet-like lawns did not consist of grass, but of a blue-green Vulcan plant that had the same effect. Although they never required mowing, the lawns were even and uniform, perfect squares, rectangles, circles, and trapezoids. The Vulcan trees, some of them actually giant herbs by biological classification, presented flawlessly spherical crowns to the sky. On Earth, such perfection would have come from loving attention and from hours of careful trimming. Here, the trees have been bred for centuries to present a pleasing aspect. Shears never touched them. Spock walked past a symmetrical group of 5 trees. Ahead of him, the pathway skirted a circular fountain, a luxury on a naturally arid planet. The water jets took various geometrical forms, cones, parabolas, and hyperbolas. The gentle splashing was almost musical and produced a curiously soothing sensation. By every right, Spock thought, I should accept all this as natural and pleasing, and yet... With a sigh, Spock turned left at the fountain and went into one of the single-story dormitories. Although they were all identical in shape and size, none were named or marked. Similarly, the suites of rooms inside were not numbered. A Vulcan, after all, would note more subtle cues in the slightly varying shades of color, the different orientation of the hallways that served as well as or better than letters and numbers inelegantly applied to the door. One such unmarked door sensed and recognized Spock and opened soundlessly. He stepped into the cool, dark common room of the suite he shared with Sarek, a distant cousin of his. Sarek was nowhere to be seen. Since the door to his private room was closed, Spock deduced that his older cousin was in his own quarters, probably studying or meditating. It was just as well. Spock went to his private cubicle. It was severe, plain, undecorated, a simple bed with no insulating covering, with perfect temperature-controlled coverlets and blankets real logical. A desk with its sleek triangular computer pad and, the one touch of individuality, an elegant, curved Vulcan harp. He touched the strings, producing not music but rather a soft, cool vibration of sound, a glitter of tones that was at once attractive and a little, though it was an emotional word, sad. Spock reclined on the bed and thought about the past few days. Knowing that Sarek had not approved of his reaction to the emergency on the Enterprise, Spock had come to the Science Academy fully determined to please his father. He had begun his studies at the Academy determined to do everything in accordance with his father's wishes. And yet his first meeting with his cousin showed him that would not be easy. So, his kinsman Sarek had said with the distance and gravity of a 20-year-old talking to someone 2 years younger than himself, I know all about your parentage, Spock. I must tell you that the masters here are most skeptical about your abilities. Spock had tilted his head and raised an eyebrow. Indeed. His voice expressed no distress, only a polite interest. I do not understand the logic. Isn't it plain? Asked Sarek. Your mother is a human, a member of a notoriously emotional species. The Academy demands complete control of one's emotions at all times. Your biological inheritance makes your accomplishing that control problematic. Therefore, since you will have the burden of working extra hard to maintain emotional balance, as well as of studying the most rigorous science courses in the galaxy, your teachers are expecting you to fail. Ah. After a moment of thought, Spock added, but permit me to say that I detect a flaw in the reasoning. Although humans feel emotions, even as Vulcans do, it is surely possible that my Vulcan side will allow me to control those feelings without undue stress. We regard that as doubtful, Sirach said. We, not they, but we. Sirach considered himself a true Vulcan, and Spock, well, something less. That was when Spock first realized that he was alone. True, at the Academy, several thousand students and instructors surrounded him, yet of all of them, Spock alone was different, an outsider, an object of curiosity. He wasn't sure that the sensation disturbed him exactly. Surely that was too close to a human emotion, but at least he was keenly aware of his difference. Though, Spock reflected as he lay on his bed, that was no surprise. He had always been something of an outsider, almost an outcast. He had always coped. For a youngster who did not fit in, there were compensations. He could read, study, take his mind off his solitary state, and now at the Vulcan Science Academy, he had the opportunity of sharing the thoughts of the greatest scientists, even those who had died centuries before and who had left their thoughts behind in written or electronic form. With that kind of company, Spock could hardly call himself lonely, and yet, the same morning he had participated in a group discussion of recent advances in artificial intelligence technology. 11 young Vulcans and 2 elderly ones had gravely, logically exchanged ideas and observations on submicroscopic circuitry. Bicameral, tricameral, and tetracameral logic drivers and other concerns. The discussion was smooth, rationally perfect, serene. Still, whenever Spock made a comment, he was always aware of a tiny pause before anyone else agreed or took his thought and offered an advancement on it. Perhaps the others did not hold him up to scorn or ridicule, but they evaluated him. Without being rude about their doubts, they took a few moments to examine his statements for illogical assumptions, flaws in reasoning, faulty judgment, human emotion. Perhaps that was really what bothered him the most. At the Vulcan Science Academy, Spock was always under close watch. Everyone, including Surik, constantly expected him to stumble. They were all waiting, not with glee, but with a kind of patient anticipation. They all seemed so certain of the outcome. He was half human. He would fail. Rising from his bed, Spock prepared for his afternoon meditation. Instead of considering some scientific proposition or some philosophical question, he reflected on his recent experiences. He chose to concentrate on a comparison of the teamwork aboard the Enterprise, a predominantly human affair, with the cooperation he observed at the Academy, and he had to admit that in doing so he discovered a certain disturbing lack of logic. The next day, after attending a long and intense demonstration of logical programming for robotic subsystems, Spock and Surik walked out of the cybernetics and robotics building together. "I have an observation," Spock said. "Really?" Surik's voice never sounded interested, just cool and a little distant. "It is this. Today and yesterday I strove very hard to add knowledge to our discussions. I believe I did so." "I would agree," said Surik. "Your observations were accurate and to the point." Spock took a deep breath. The dry air smelled faintly of water from a distant leaping fountain. "Yet the instructors appear hesitant to acknowledge my contributions. They behave as if what I say lacks validity." "Of course." Surik sounded as if it were the most natural behavior in the world. "Can you explain this?" Spock asked. Surik gave him an appraising glance. I have told you before that everyone here knows of your history and parentage. It is a human failing to arrive at conclusions before thoroughly examining the evidence. However, Spock reminded him, in no case has anyone shown that my conclusions are insufficiently supported. No, but there is always a possibility that they will be. Therefore, what you say must be regarded as having less reliability than what I might say or what any other student might say. Of course, your participation in class must be suspect, Spock. A human weakness might show up at any time. They reached the fountain. Let us sit here for a few moments, Spock said. They shared a bench facing the astrophysics building's spires and domes. Behind them, the water made a rushing, hissing sound as it sprayed in dozens of fan-shaped eruptions. Spock studied the austere buildings as he gathered his thoughts. At last he said, Surik, I do not know if you have heard of the passage that my father and I took in returning to Vulcan from Marith. I have not. We traveled aboard a Starfleet vessel, the Enterprise. Do you know of it? Not specifically. I know the general design concepts of Starfleet vessels, of course. Many of their design refinements have come from advances in Vulcan science. The hot sunlight was almost a physical pressure, heavy on Spock's right cheek and shoulder. A group of 3 students and 1 master strolled past, their voices hushed as they discussed a problem in ethics, their shadows dark, moving pools beneath their feet. When the 4 had gone by, Spock said, Is not the concept of Vulcan science a strange one? How do you mean? Spock looked at his cousin. The 2 were much alike in the Vulcan way. Dark hair, pointed ears, sharply slanting eyebrows. Perhaps Surik was somewhat paler, thinner, taller, and more purely Vulcan. After a moment, Spock said slowly, I cannot see that there is a Vulcan science and a human science, or any other kind. There is only science. That is an illogical statement, Surik said at once. No, Spock insisted. All science, whether it is Vulcan, human, even Klingon, aims at knowledge and truth. The methods used to gain those goals really do not matter as much as the results do. But human science often is stumbling, trial and error, a tedious pursuit, Surik said. Vulcan science is thoroughly logical and rational. Because of our methods of thought, our experiments never produce unexpected or unusable results. We are far too disciplined ever to be surprised. Vulcan science is a process of logical unfolding, not of mere discovery. He pronounced discovery as though it were a mildly vulgar word. I must disagree. Let me give you an example that may show you what I mean. Aboard the Enterprise, Spock said slowly, I saw a crew of several hundred individuals applying science. They were not a uniform body. Humans are more varied than Vulcans in temperament, and they did not try to conceal their emotions. They joked, they became tense, they even were afraid at times, and yet they accomplished their goals. Even more, as they did so, I sensed something there that I do not sense here. What is that? Acceptance, Spock said. Surik got to his feet. There. You see exactly your human failing. Spock squinted up at him. I am sorry, but I do not. With a gesture of impatience, Surik replied, To desire to be among humans is not logical for a Vulcan. As you yourself just said, humans are slaves to their emotions. I do not believe I said that. What were your words? They did not try to conceal their emotions. They joked. They became tense. They even were afraid at times. Surroundings like that do not encourage serenity of thought and logical actions. Even worse, such responses are contagious, Spock. If you lived among humans, how long would it be before your heredity made you truly one of them? You have a good mind, my cousin. It would be a shame to make it prey to every disturbing emotion that might come your way. Spock stood. My father works with humans and with many other species, yet I do not believe he has caught the disease of emotion. Your father is a Vulcan, Sarek reminded him. And so the matter rested for another day. Spock kept thinking of arguments he might use to persuade his cousin of his point, and yet he did not use them. For he thought, what if he is partly correct? What if the acceptance I experienced aboard the Enterprise has affected me emotionally? He was not sure that the sensation of belonging, of being accepted for that he was, actually was an emotion. Still, as Sarek had warned him, pleasurable feelings were the most treacherous ones, and certainly he felt the effects of the skepticism that he saw on the faces of his fellow students and, a little better concealed, on those of the masters. After the evening meal on the following night, Spock again raised the point with Sarek. They sat in their common room, and their discussion was far too calm to have been called an argument. Spock's words were soft, and Sarek's responses were no louder. Their points were made by logical progression. Still, despite their cordiality, Sarek again was sure that Spock was wrong. You were raised on Vulcan, he pointed out. Your father is Vulcan. Therefore, by both education and by heredity, you should be most at home among Vulcans. To think that human associations would be superior is to give in to your weak human heritage. A chime interrupted him. 3 soft chords of music. From Spock's room came a computerized voice. A message from Sarek for his son, Spock. Spock rose and hurried into his room. Spock here, he said to the triangular computer base. Proceed with your message. Surprised, Spock glanced at Sarek, who raised one eyebrow in silent inquiry. Spock said, Why must I return home, Father? Your mother is recovering, Sarek said. What happened? Spock could not keep an edge of urgency from creeping into his voice, and he spoke more loudly than he had intended. A flicker of distaste showed in Sarek's eyes. Spock, do not give in to emotions. I called to tell you that Amanda has been attacked. For your own safety and for that of the family, you must return home at once.